Part 1 of Security by Powell Anderson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Greg Marguerite. Part 1 of Security by Powell Anderson. In a world where security is all important, nothing can ever be secure. A mountain climbing vacation may wind up in deep space, or loyalty may prove to be high treason. But it has its rewards. It had been a tough day at the lab. One of those days when nothing seems to be able to go right. And, of course, it had been precisely the day Hammond, the efficiency inspector, would choose to stick his nose in. Another mark in his little notebook. And enough marks like that meant a D-rating, and Control had a habit of sending D-rated labmen to Venus. That wasn't a criminal punishment, but it amounted to the same thing. Alan Lancaster had no fear of it for himself. The sector chief of a project was under direct Control jurisdiction rather than efficiency, and Control was friendly to him. But he'd hate to see young Rogers get it. The boy had been married only a week now. To top the day off, a report had come to Lancaster's desk from Sector 7 of the project. Security had finally cleared it for general transmission to sector chiefs, and it was the complete design of an electronic valve on which some of the best men in Lancaster's own division, Sector 13, had been sweating for 6 months. There went half a year's work down the drain, all for nothing, and Lancaster would have that much less to show at the next project reckoning. He had cursed for several minutes straight, drawing the admiring glances of his assistants. It was safe enough for a high-ranking labman to gripe about security. In fact, it was more or less expected. Scientists had their privileges. One of these was a private 3-room apartment. Another was an extra liquor ration. Tonight, as he came home, Lancaster decided to make a dent in the latter. He'd eaten at the commissary as usual, but hadn't stayed to talk. All the way home in the tube, he'd been thinking of that whiskey and soda. Now it sparkled gently in his glass, and he sighed, letting a smile crease his lean, homely face. He was a tall man, a little stooped, his clothes, uniform and mufti alike, perpetually rumpled. Solitary by nature, he was still unmarried in spite of the bachelor tax, and had only one son. The boy was 10 years old now, must be in the Youth Guard. Lancaster wasn't sure, never having seen him. It was dark outside his windows, but a glow above the walls across the skyway told of the city pulsing and murmuring beyond. He liked the quiet of his evenings alone, and had withstood a good deal of personal and official pressure to serve in various patriotic organizations. "Damn it," he had explained, "I'm not doing routine work. I'm on a project, and I need relaxation of my own choosing." He selected a tape from his library. Eine kleine Nachtmusik lilted joyously about him as he found a chair and sat down. Control hadn't gotten around to making approved lists of music yet, though you'd surely never hear Mozart in a public place. Lancaster got a cigar from the humidor and collapsed his long, gaunt body across chair and hassock. Smoke, whiskey, good music. They washed his mind clean of worry and frustration. He drifted off in a mist of unformed dreams. Yes, it wasn't such a bad world. The mail tube went ping, and he opened his eyes, swearing. For a moment he was tempted to let the pneumo roll lie where it fell, but habit was too strong. He grumbled his way over to the basket and took it out. The stamp across it jerked his mind to wakefulness. Official secret, for addressee only, and a security seal. After a moment he swallowed his thumping heart. It couldn't be serious, not as far as he personally was concerned anyway. If that had been the case, a squad of monitors would have been at the door, not this message tube. He broke the seal and unfolded the flimsy with elaborate care. Slowly he scanned it. Underneath the official letterhead the words were curt: "This is a matter of urgency and is top secret. Destroy this letter and the tube containing it. Tomorrow, 15 June, at 21:30 hours, you will go to the Observatory, a nightclub at 5730 Victory Street, and ask the head waiter for a Mr. Berg. You will assume that he is an old friend of yours, and that this is a social evening. The usual penalties are involved for failure to comply." There was no signature. Lancaster stood for a moment, trying to imagine what this might be. There was a brief chill of sweat on his skin. Then he suppressed his emotions. He had nothing to fear. His record was clean, and he wasn't being arrested. His mind wandered rebelliously off on something that had occurred to him before. Admittedly, the new phonetic orthography was more efficient than the old, if less aesthetic. But since little of the earlier literature was being reissued in modern spelling, not too many books had actually been condemned as subversive. Only a few works on history, politics, philosophy, and the like, together with some scientific texts restricted for security reasons. But one by one the great old writings were sent to forgetfulness. Well, these were critical times. There wasn't material and energy to spare for irrelevant details. No doubt when complete peace was achieved there would be a renaissance. Meanwhile he, Lancaster, had his Euripides and Goethe and whatever else he liked, or knew where to borrow it. As for this message, they must want him for something big, maybe something really interesting. Nevertheless, his evening was ruined. The observatory was like most approved recreation spots, large and raucous, selling unrationed food and drink and amusement at uncontrolled prices, of which the government took its usual lion's share. The angle in this place was astronomy. The ceiling was a blue haze, aglitter with slowly wheeling constellations, and the strippers began with make-believe spacesuits. There were some rather good murals on the walls depicting various stages of the conquest of space. Lancaster was amused at one of them. When he'd been here 3 years ago, the first landing on Ganymede had shown a group of men unfurling a German flag. It had stuck in his mind because he happened to know that the first expedition there had actually been Russian. But that was all right, seeing that Germany was an ally at the time. But now that Europe was growing increasingly cold to the idea of an American-dominated world, the Ganymedean pioneers were holding a good, safe Stars and Stripes. Oh well, you had to keep the masses happy. They couldn't see that their sacrifices and the occasional short wars were necessary to prevent another real smash-up like the one 75 years ago. Lancaster's annoyance was directed at the sullen foreign powers and the traitors within his own land. It was because of them that science had to be straitjacketed by security regulations. The head waiter bowed before him. "I'm looking for a friend," said Lancaster. A Mr. Berg." "Yes, sir. This way, please." Lancaster slouched after him. He'd worn the dress uniform of a project officer, but he felt that all eyes were on its deplorable sloppiness. The head waiter conducted him between tables of half-crocked customers. Burly, black uniformed Space Guardsmen, Army and Air officers, richly clad industrialists and union bosses, civilian leaders, their wives and mistresses. The waiters were all Martian slaves. He noticed their phosphorescent owl eyes smoldering in the dim blue light. He was ushered into a curtained booth. There was an auto dispenser so that those using it need not be interrupted by servants, and an ultrasonic globe on the table was already vibrating to soundproof the region. Lancaster's gaze went to the man sitting there. In spite of being short, he was broad-shouldered and compact in plain gray evening pajamas. His face was round and freckled, almost cherubic under a shock of sandy hair, but there were merry little devils in his eyes. "Good evening, Dr. Lancaster," he said. "Please sit down. What'll you have?" "Thanks. I'll have a Scotch and soda." Might as well make this expensive if the government was footing the bill, and if this Berg thought him un-American for drinking an imported beverage, what of it? The scientist lowered himself into the seat opposite his host. "I'm having the same, as a matter of fact," said Berg mildly. He twirled the dial and slipped a couple of $5 coins into the dispenser slot. When the tray was ejected, he sipped his drink appreciatively and looked across the rim of the glass at the other man. "You're a high-ranking